I'm delighted to that you can join today's webinar, where we're going to have an opportunity to talk about our exciting program of research being conducted, that we're planning to be conducted at CGHE over the next 3 years as a result of some additional funding that we've gained from the ESRC. And it's a very exciting program. And sorry, I should have introduced myself. I'm Claire Callender. I'm Professor of Higher Education at UCL IOE, and I'm the Deputy Director of CGHE. And to give you a flavour of the activities that we're going to be involved in and the research that we're going to be doing over the next 3 years, we have 3 speakers. Firstly, Simon Marginson. Simon is the principal investigator of CGHE, of the Centre for Global Higher Education, and he is Professor of Higher Education at the University of Oxford. Then going further afield, we have Kaho Mok from Lingnan University, Hong Kong. And finally, we have Janja Komljenovic from Lancaster University, and she's a lecturer in higher education at Lancaster and works on CG's on various projects to do with or engagement in higher education engagement and other issues to do with the marketization of higher education. So before Simon talks to us, let's start off by the housekeeping points in terms of the webinars. So firstly, the important thing to note is that this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available at the CGHE website after the webinar. Now, please keep yourselves muted during the presentations, unless you're asked to unless you're asked to speak or to ask a question. Now, I think it might be a good idea to put your screen on the speaker view, then you can see more clearly when somebody is presenting. And at the end of the presentations, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions. And during the presentations, you can place your questions in the chat box. And then I'll ask you to address your questions to whoever it is you want to answer them. So if you could put those in the chat box, I'll keep an eye on those, and I'll let you know if your question has been selected. And if you are called upon to answer a question, then please unmute and unmute yourself and put on your video and state your name and what institution you're coming from. So I'll now pass over to our first speaker, which is Simon. Simon, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks, Claire. I better get the share screen going. Okay, so it's not showing, just a sec. This does happen sometimes. There we are. Can you see that? Can you see this?
Yes, it's good.
Yes.
Thank you.
All well. Okay, away we go. Wonderful to see so many people have taken an interest in us as a research centre, as well as the content of our normal webinars. We've had a great experience with the webinar program, and we're very committed to developing it with your help. And that's one of the things I'll talk about during this presentation. Now, the study of higher education, research on higher education, is a small research field compared to, say, the study of the financial system or agriculture or the law. But how important higher education has become to societies. I mean, there are so many things that it does. It's at the intersection of key human activities. Knowledge flows and circuits. We don't produce all of the knowledge that human beings deal with, but we produce codified and scientifically verified knowledge, and that knowledge plays a direct role in many spheres of activity in the economy and society, government. We allocate people to social opportunities and social positions. We're not the only institution that does that, but we clearly play a central role in modern societies, especially in relation to occupations and the workplace. We are, in many respects, provide conditions for the economic activity, more indirect than direct, but of course, one of our most important economic functions is that the people who graduate from higher education go into the whole range of public and private occupations. And of course, research and science also feed directly into the production process. And we are also adjunct to governance and political relations. And I might add there international relations, where our role arguably is very important and probably as important as any other social sector except government itself. So we do all these things, and we do them on a scale which has changed dramatically. So higher education has its origins in the medieval European university. And what was crucial and what made the European university different to higher education, higher learning in China, India, and the Islamic world, where it was also very significantly developed, was the autonomy or the partial autonomy that the European universities, by an historical accident, I think, gained vis-a-vis the church and the state at the time. And that sliver of autonomy has been central in then building the role of higher education in the modern era as a partly independent sector in its own right, in the way that, say, law is a sector in its own right. It's not wholly controlled directly by the executive arm of the state and so on. So this presence of a sector with its own identity was really important. But for a long time, of course, higher education was small. And the higher education we have now didn't really jump fully fledged from the European university. I mean, it's really come from the German branch of the European university in the modern period, which brought science and freedom to learn and freedom to teach into the equation, and the transfiguration of that in the American higher education system. And arguably, the template which dominates higher education worldwide is that of the American multiversity, as Clark Kerr called it, the organization with an enormous range of social functions, constituencies, agendas, and so on, and with no one single identifying purpose, but many purposes serving many different interests. Now, arguably the most important activity of higher education is that we form people, or rather we help people to form themselves. And it's in this function that higher education has exploded in growth. It's much bigger than it was in the 1960s when Clark Kerr talked about the multiversity, and far, far bigger than medieval European university. We're now in a situation where almost 40% of all young people in all countries will go into some kind of tertiary education. And of that, about 80% is degree-based tertiary education. Arguably, that could be the dividing line for higher education, couldn't it? So you could say 80% of that, 40% is higher education. So it's now not only a mass business, but it's becoming something which in many countries, an overwhelming majority of people participate in. And there are now a large number of countries where more than 3/4 of the population go into some form of tertiary education. And higher education has proved to be remarkably resilient during the pandemic. And it shows how central its role is. It's kept going, it's been kept going, and its families, its students want it to keep going. So for all the talk from time to time about parts of higher education being useless for the economy or low value, or all the doubts and questions around its validity or usefulness at a social level, the society again and again makes it clear that it values not only higher education, but it values the old style face-to-face teaching and learning form of higher education. And one of the poignant parts of the pandemic has been to see how deeply students and faculty and academic faculty feel about the importance and value of the classroom, of the direct interaction, of the human organic learning process that occurs when we talk to someone and we think of things which we wouldn't have thought of in any other way. The stimulating effect of a relational-based higher education system. There's no doubt that the return to easy face-to-face delivery is going to be welcomed everywhere, which isn't to say that we haven't done very well with online education in many countries. I think an online education has developed really well, often, not everywhere, but often, and we have achieved technical mastery of it, normal use of it, and we've also found in those countries that are working in this rather difficult hybrid form, ways in which we can mix online forms and face-to-face forms. So this has been really valuable in terms of developing the reach, the potential, the possibilities of higher education. And of course, the period of the pandemic has also underlined the value of collaborative research. And to get a vaccine in 3 prototypes in less than a year, when the normal expectation around a SARS vaccine was 2, 3 or more years, was really remarkable. And that shows what the world's researchers working together can really do now. But as higher education expands towards the majority of the population at world level, and that's remarkable, it runs into this constraint that it's so difficult to make it into a meritocratic system in which everyone gets equal opportunity by attending a higher education institutions. I mean, not only is half of our population still not there, and there's of course a marked skew in who's not there. Non-white populations in European countries are not there in the same numbers as white populations. In some disciplines still, women are not there in the same numbers as men. In many countries, most countries, rural families are less well represented and so on. So not only do we have an underrepresentation, an incomplete inclusion problem, but it's so difficult, isn't it, to reconfigure higher education so that the poor, bright student, in inverted commas, the classic meritocratic subject, can enter the elite universities at the same rate as the middle-class families, because middle-class families have resources they can mobilize to ensure that they can work the system in their favor. And that's a social fact. And I think that those of us who devote ourselves to equity, and we should, and by doing so, of course, we manage to reduce the degree of inequality in the society. But those of us who devote ourselves to equity are persistently frustrated and disappointed that we're unable to achieve a redistribution of social opportunity at a more dramatic scale through higher education. I think we have to face the fact that in a highly massified system, that constraint is going to be very difficult to overcome. We have to keep pursuing fairness, equality, especially in relation to underrepresented groups. But by doing that, we are not going to equalize incomes. We're not going to change the wage structure. We're not going to change the tax and spend system. We need changes in those domains if we are to achieve greater social equality overall. Higher education is only part of the mix. And I would also say that we should not be disappointed at what we are achieving, because by bringing more and more people through every year, by providing for social formation at higher education level on the scale that we do an enormous amount of good, and we produce a society which is more inclusive in that sense. And there's also global research and science, and our contribution in that area alone is enormous, and perhaps almost as important as the educational function. And the COVID-19, climate change, I mean, all of the big issues depend on higher education institutions, amongst other research agencies, to tackle and solve them. So, I mean, governments have difficulty cooperating with each other, but scientists, scholars, academics, students seem to cooperate across borders very, very well. And I think there's a lesson in that for everyone. So that's the kind of sector which the Centre for Global Higher Education addresses this vast higher education and research sector, which worldwide, with its different permutations, different contexts, and where our mission, I think, like it is always in educational research, is to seek improvement, to make the contributions of higher education to society, economy, culture, and politics more effective, better distributed, more efficient, and more long-lasting and stable, and in their contributions to the societies that we're in. CG's job is to conduct research which works towards the improvement of the functions which we study. In that process, we study them also in a kind of basic research sense. We seek to understand those functions, and that's part of the process of improvement. And we do that in CG in a distinctive way by being a globally distributed centre and with a global mandate as part of our research mandate. And I'll talk about that a bit further. So this is the formula for the next 3 years, 10 projects. 8 of them are continuing projects which we've been conducting in the first phase of CG, which has been happening since 2015, a 5-year centre. 8 of the projects will bring that work to fruition, will complete the academic publications and build the impact of that research and communicate it and discuss it worldwide, but in some respects advance and continue it as well. And there are 2 new projects in important areas. I mean, one of them is in relation to the key role that research plays in higher education, and the other is about mapping aspects of the supranational, the cross-border higher education space. And we'll be looking at Central Asia and the Caucasus. We'll be looking at Africa, the role of donors and private companies in African higher education is part of that. And we'll also be looking at Europe and what's happening in relation to higher education in Europe post-Brexit. So different parts of the supranational space. We've done quite a lot of work on East Asia in the first 5 years, and we're now broadening to other regions. I'm not going to take you through the projects in detail. It takes quite a while, and there's good information now on our website, and I had the URL for the website in the previous slide. But we do have the project leaders here in the webinar, and I'm sure they would, individual project leaders would welcome any questions you have about their projects. My colleague Kaho Mok, who will speak during this presentation part of the webinar, is leading one of those projects, but as is Claire Callender, and there are others as well. So let me invite that kind of conversation. And of course, these projects will and already have been part of our webinar program as we go. When we've got major new findings, you can be sure that they're going to find their way into the webinar setting as well as into publications. This is our shiny new Research Management Committee. We've doubled the old Research Management Committee in size for the Transition Centre the next 3 years. We've brought in more early and mid-career researchers, and we've brought in 2 internationals instead of 1 as we had before. I'm really looking forward to working with our expanded group of colleagues who've already had their first meeting. So that's the sort of nuts and bolts, the outline of the structure. And there's more, as I said, on the website. But what I want to do, and partly on Paul Ashwin's suggestion, is try and engage you in what I think is the rationale or the imaginary, as some would put it, behind this global research centre on higher education, the Centre for Global Higher Education, developed in 2015 when the idea of a global centre was perhaps less problematic than it was. But let me say this in relation to the global. We are not seeing a cessation of the trend to global convergence. It continues. What we are now seeing, I think, is something which many have predicted, which is that we have moved away from the old Anglo-American dominated uniform standardized form of globalization to a much more complicated environment where cultures, nations, institutions are converging, are moving closer across borders, but their differences, their contrasts are becoming as obvious as their similarities and their commonalities. So we're moving from, as I said, a kind of neo-imperial period, the 1990s globalization of Bill Clinton's time, into an environment where it's much more multipolar, where there are different cultures, where all need to learn to live with each other, learn from each other where they can, and establish an environment in which they cooperate rather than they conflict. And it's challenging. And this, of course, markedly affects higher education, this form of global convergence. Now, what is the global? Well, we talked about that quite a lot in CG, and there are various models or ideas about what the world is that are around. And I would hope to see a smile on someone's face at this point, because I'm not altogether wholly serious in this part of the presentation. There are different models about what the world is. And those models are, of course, available to us as higher education researchers. There are different notions of, the human condition and how to map it out at worldwide level. Now, some ideas, some paradigms, perhaps less convincing than others. I think about 20% of people in the United States do believe the Earth is flat, but we decided to go with the majority on that one, and stick to the round ball version. So what do we mean by global? Well, I would make the argument that technically we can understand the global in three senses in higher education and in other sectors. Firstly, global systems, and this is systems at the level of the world or the planetary, systems that may cut across national and all other boundaries. Global ecology clearly is a system. It doesn't respect national boundaries particularly or any other boundaries. There's a single world in an ecological sense. It's interdependent. This is the best example we have of the global, if you like, at a system level. But there's also global science. I mean, it to some respects constitutes a global system, and I'll talk about that a little in a moment. Secondly, there's the more orthodox, I suppose, idea of the global or the international, which is connections across borders. And this is when people talk about internationalization in higher education, they're usually referring to mobility, the research partnerships, university agreements, that kind of thing. But there's a third sense, I suppose, in which ideas spread everywhere. Global diffusion, models of the university spread. The Anglo-American Science University model has spread worldwide with all its strengths and weaknesses. Ideas about good management or faculty behavior or how the doctorate works are still spreading across borders. So global systems, cross-border connections, and global diffusion, and all of them enter into our research in some way. So what's distinctive about our work is that we're sensitive to these dimensions of higher education and science in a way which most other research centres are not, because it's not part of their mandate. And we're aware of how these things affect local and national policy activity. So whereas most research focuses on the local management problems, efficiency problems, student satisfaction, or the policy issues like equity or graduate employment, we also look at the global and we bring that into conjunction with the other parts. Now, of all of the issues which we have on our plate, one which is not part of our 10 projects, but is part of Tristan McGowan's Global Challenges Research Fund project, and Tristan's one of our researchers, so he is a kind of cousin project to CG. Arguably, this is the most important single issue facing higher education longer term, what role it plays in relation to developing global sustainability and survival. And we're very interested in Tristan's work, and we're very interested in the work of his colleagues around the world, and we'll be supporting that work and participating where that's useful to him and his colleagues. Most significant dimension of higher education, I think in 10 years' time, it'll be much more important than it is now. Another way in which the global comes into our affairs is, of course, online education itself, where a set of prototypes or techniques which enable us to work globally, and this global webinar is, of course, one example of that, have direct implications for local student learning and activity. And hasn't that been important during the pandemic? And I think what online also does is it's alerted us to a whole dimension of issues around equity, around the digital divide. And when we found that in the UK, 27% of enrolled students in just before summer did not have adequate access to their online programs because of lack of internet access or poor internet access, or more often lack of devices or lack of space in their family or home environment in which to work free of disruption. 27% in the UK lacked adequate access. You can see what the situation is like in, say, a country like India, where only about 1 in 10 people have stable access in rural areas. 1 in 10 have stable access to any kind of connection to the internet. And of course, a mobile phone is not nearly as good as a laptop or a desktop to computer in terms of accessing online higher education in its full sense. So we have a major problem, major challenge, and I think not sufficiently being addressed by government as yet. Now, another global dimension is, of course, research and science. And it is a global system, but I should say that English language science has become a global system. 25% of all papers are now co-authored across borders. So there's a great deal of collaboration. 55,000 papers were published jointly by authors from China and the US in 2018, despite the fact that the countries were moving towards geopolitical conflict. You know, it's enormously important, the collaboration in research. But there is, of course, other knowledge produced in the world which isn't part of this global science system, knowledge which at the moment is operating at local or national levels only. I'll come back to that. The part of the process of growth of science has been the diffusion of research capability across more and more countries. So we now have a situation where in 1987, only 20 countries produced 90% of all global science. Now it's more than 32, because it was 32 in 2017. So you're seeing this, you know, spread of research systems across the world. Research and science are no longer North American, Western European, Russia, and Japan. You know, the middle income countries, some lower income countries now have developed knowledge systems. Another system which we're engaged in researching is, of course, the student mobility system. And we're watching closely what's happening during the pandemic and the massive disruptions to student mobility that are occurring. My impression is that in general in the pandemic and in relation to student mobility in particular, the countries which provide higher education as a public good and support it through the state adequately are the ones which are handling student mobility issues better and will bounce back better at the end of the pandemic. Certainly, you can expect Germany and Japan, I think, both places which have been relatively safe during the pandemic for ordinary citizens, and also provide international education on a non-market basis to be able to take any number of students that they like after the pandemic passes. On the other hand, I think it's also true that the US and UK, which are such high demand countries because of the English language factor, is so strong at world level, I think they will spring back as well. The other English language providers may struggle a bit more to restore their position, but certainly mobility's, you know, been knocked for six, as they say, and it will take some repairing in the next 2-3 years. But not just mobility can affect, not just the pandemic can affect mobility. Geopolitics can affect student mobility as well. And we're beginning to see this with the disruptions to movements of Chinese research students into parts of the STEM system in the United States. And the American universities, of course, very concerned about that. But you know, students are being stopped at the airport, subject to pretty tough questions, or they're not getting visas, or they're getting visas which are for 1 year and not 3, can't do a doctorate, that kind of thing. So clearly, there's a lot going on there. And I think that who's been friendly to who will have quite an unfortunate effect on the freedom of people to engage academically with each other in the next few years. So geopolitics matters, and it's something which has come up again and again in CG's work. I mean, and I think that we need to recognise that we're at a key turning point in relation to geopolitics now. The traditional dominance of the Anglo-American countries and Western Europe is eroding fundamentally and will not be restored. Agency in the rest of the world is advancing. Knowledge and perspectives from outside the Anglo-American, Western European sphere is becoming more important. It is pushing forward, although that's not really clearly expressed yet in, say, a university ranking system or in the global science system. And I think the European world, broadly speaking, including North America, needs to address its colonial and racist past. And that is coming up at a practical level in local higher education institutions across the, especially the English-speaking countries, but more generally across the European world. And the debates that are occurring in the English universities about statues and vestiges of colonialism are playing out in other places as well, like Belgium, in relation to the Congo and so on. So what we're seeing is a period where decolonization is fundamentally advancing, and that is part of this process of shifting geopolitics. More room is being made bit by bit for greater cultural, linguistic, and epistemological diversity in higher education. Now, in CG, we've understood the geopolitics of higher education partly by recognising the importance of regions. We worked a lot on building relationships between the UK and East Asia in research on higher education and building our knowledge of this extraordinarily dynamic and important region in the world as it is now, becoming as, or if not already, as important as Europe, and in some STEM disciplines already, the strongest region in the world. So really significant. And but we need to broaden our work, and we are broadening our work to other regions. We're doing more work on India, we're doing more work on Africa, and we want to build activity in Latin America, while also keeping our awareness of the importance of relationships in higher education in Europe. Because the regions vary enormously, and they vary, of course, dramatically in terms of resources and the level of participation. And those differences are important, and they do, I think, suggest activity and action, and they require research, they require monitoring, they require cooperation. But inequalities, let me emphasize this, inequalities are not just inequalities in relation to the dominant template in the West or the dominant income levels in the West. Inequalities are about hegemony, about cultural factors, about linguistic monopoly, and so on. So they go beyond the purely quantitative economic inequalities, although they're centrally important because resources really matter. And resources are one of the keys to agency without question. So, but we need to recognize that power is exerted, not just through trading inequalities or differences in per capita income. It's also exerted through standard templates, dominant models, and the requirement that the world-class university is necessarily like an American or a British university. The requirement that being international in higher education means being English speaking, which is how it is for most researchers in the non-English speaking countries. The requirement that new nations in building their higher education and science must follow the same template, and they're judged and found wanting to the extent that they haven't reached the same level as the owners of that template. So it means inverting the North-South dualism, giving the South the central position in our concerns, and building new prototypes in relation to what the South does. But it's a lot more than South-North. It's a lot more than colonial, post-colonial. The world is more complicated than that. It's changed too dramatically in the last 20 years. So it's also about the fact that India and China will have the largest trading relationship in the world by about 2040. That'll be very, very significant. Regardless of the state of play in the geopolitics between the two countries, their economic relationship alone will be that important. And also China and Africa, and the importance and the question marks around China's role in Africa, not the same as European colonization, but not a symmetrical or equal relationship either. So that's pretty interesting and pretty important to understand in higher education and science. And I mean, there's the more broadly, there's the fact that East-South relationships are becoming as important as North-South relationships. So multipolar world, multiple cultural examples, multiple languages. That's the kind of terrain we're moving into. The old Anglo-American hegemonic world in higher education was much more simple. It gets more interesting now. And I want to finish really on this topic of language, because I think it's the greatest challenge. It's the hardest issue for us in higher education and in higher education research, to look beyond the global monoculture in higher education and science. Now, there's only about 400 or less than 400 million people for whom English is the first language. So haven't we English speakers done well out of the deal? English, the first language of less than 400 million, but the language of science and the dominant language in the university sector worldwide. Wow, that was pretty good, wasn't it? Unfortunately, if you're not an English native first language English speaker, it makes it a bit harder. And there are other potential languages which could form this crucial role of a bridge between all of us, and which will produce different imaginings, different ways of understanding, different science, as well as different social science and different humanities and arts. I mean, Chinese is a major language. It's not just about China and English, though. Spanish is a major language in the world, and some of the best work in higher education studies is done in Spanish and Portuguese from Brazil, and it's not translated into English. And we sometimes see some of this work, and it's really interesting what it's saying about the role of the university in society at the present time. But it's not part of the common conversation yet, because Spanish and Portuguese are not treated as global languages, and translation from other languages into English doesn't happen. All the translation seems to be from English into other languages, which only increases the dominance of the English language way of thinking. Not just Spanish, of course, but French, a major language. And, you know, you can go on. Arabic, centrally important in North Africa and the Middle East. I think multiple translation and the idea of a single pool of material, which includes knowledge coming from multiple origins and multiple languages, is a really crucial next step in world science. Now, we're doing our best in a small way in CGHE to encourage this idea of global plurality and diversity of ways of seeing, knowing that different ways of seeing different civilizational starting points give us different understandings. The ecological crisis will not be solved entirely by West European and North American views of the world. Clearly, we're not very good yet at collective operations in relation to the ecological crisis. Other parts of the world, other traditions might have more to offer there. That's just one example of how we need to be able to draw on multiple perspectives and ways of seeing. And in the CGHE webinar program, we hope to facilitate that process. So stay involved in our seminars. Keep an eye out for our publications. Talk to us. Tell us what you'd like to see us doing. Contribute to our activities where you can, and we'll listen and we'll develop and we'll change, and we hope we'll become more plural, more global, but no less national and local, and take the world back home and home to the world at the same time. So let's do that. Let's build a common understanding of higher education and research so they can achieve their fuller potential, which is also the fuller potential of the societies in which they're in. Thank you for giving your attention to the presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Simon. That was great and tremendous food for thought, and a very insightful way in which the developments globally are influencing what we're doing at CGHE and how it will inform where we're going over the next 3 years. I think I'd like to move on, and so we'll have questions all together at the end of all the presentations. So Janja, would you like to take over the floor? Thank you. Thanks, Simon.
Yes, thank you, Claire, and thank you, Simon, for the excellent presentation. So I have a very limited time. I was given 5 minutes, and I will therefore make only 3 points. The first point is about the broader socio-political and economic context, but highly relevant for higher education. The second around higher education as a sector, and the third about higher education research as a field and the role of CGHE in it. Now, in terms of the broader context, the pandemic obviously seems to be most important and impactful phenomena that we are living through at the moment. The pandemic evoked emergency responses by universities around the world, and new technologies have started being used or even more thoroughly integrated in the core of universities' functioning. Now, Simon already touched upon these issues, but what I want to add here is the role of the education technology industry in this context, which is evident. So companies are offering particular digital products and services and they are still portrayed as saviors of the situation on many occasions. So what was once on the fringe of the sector is now deeply embedded and instituted in it, and that is technically, legally, and financially as well. Now, what is relevant to note here is it is not only that these platforms are offering services like connecting us to communicate, like we are doing here today, but they are also offering new kinds of services actually doing work via sorting and classifying, algorithms suggesting decisions, making choices, and so on. So there is already research around this, but it is only emerging, and practice is really ahead of theory and policy as well as academic research. So just what kind of new actors are we now actually seeing being deeply embedded in the sector? The pandemic also showed the need to rethink public services in general and in the sector specifically, and we can learn from experience in different countries with different governance arrangements, where it seems that in contexts where marketization forces are more prominent in higher education, the struggles of the sector were higher and more substantial. So this brings to the fore the question of what roles we want higher education to serve and how best to govern that. These are not new questions, but there are fundamentally new circumstances. And this is especially if we keep in mind the restructuring of the global economy more broadly beyond the pandemic and other profound political and economic changes that are ongoing, including the financialization of the economy, as well as the rise of the digital economy. Just think of the image that Simon showed before, the fight between US and China and the row around TikTok, for example. So the second point I want to make is about the higher education as such. Long gone are the days when we thought of the sector as only universities delivering only traditional degrees. And in the past couple of decades, the sector has been resectoralizing, as we like to say, with what we can call a multi-actor, multi-issue, and multi-scalar governance model. And most recently, we see a fast emergence of unbundling of higher education via micro-credentials, digital badges, stack-up certificates, and the like. So other actors than universities or in partnerships are delivering content and providing certificates. The intensified focus on employability and digital skills align well with shorter training and digital delivery. Many countries are in fact amending their national qualification frameworks to include these micro-credentials and somehow formally recognize them. We might see this as a rebirth of lifelong learning or lifelong learning entering a 2.0 mode. Now, the question here is, what is the transformative potential of higher education in this new mode? And here I'm using Paul Ashwin's terminology. So at the same time, we notice a rise of populism, new social movements, and questioning of the role of the expert and the academic in our societies. And all of this again raises the questions around the role of the university as a social institution and who it is serving locally, regionally, globally, and digitally. And who is the legitimate actor in the higher education sector in terms of the providers or partners? Who are the students? And how is the student agency changing? Now, the final point is on higher education research as a field and the role of CG in it. It seems to me, and that's just my personal observation, that we see a great increase in variety and criticality in higher education research. Theoretical and empirical work is getting richer. Higher education is increasingly a sector of interest also in other disciplines and journals, and I believe this is a much welcomed development. What I wish for the future is that we continue down this path, and with the started work. Also, that the higher education research community is bold and innovative in our theoretical and empirical approach, so that we are able to grasp the changing context of higher education as a sector. Under the excellent leadership of Simon Marginson and outstanding work of all CGHE researchers, the Centre has established itself as a key research authority in the field in the UK and internationally, I think. In the past 4 years, it has covered key higher education processes across scales, so from local to global, across issues, including a wide range of themes and social and economic dimensions, and across a multitude of actors. And I'm delighted that we are able to keep pursuing essential research questions and continue with our work in the coming 3 years. It will be critical, however, that we incorporate the changing context and the transformation of the sector mentioned before. I'm very much looking forward to participating in the CGHE work and working with the excellent scholars. Thank you.
That's great, Janja. Thank you very much indeed. That really is good. Okay, can we now go over to Kaho Mok, who's sitting in Hong Kong, and it's some ungodly hour there. But thank you, Kaho.
Unmute myself. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Well, congratulations to Simon and Claire for leading CGHE in the last 5 years, building a very strong foundation for moving on to the next 3 years transition centers project. I certainly agree with the two previous speakers, what they have said. And yeah, we are living in uncertain futures, but I think it particularly point out the importance about higher education research in the amidst the COVID-19 crisis and even beyond. So the first point I want to respond is about research in higher education. I think this is extremely important, as Simon has outlined. It's not only about national level, regional level, and global level. And with the advanced technology, we celebrate that we can make use of online education, but at the same time, empirical evidence has suggested through this particular unprecedented global health crisis, we are finding our world is even divided. And we are lucky now enjoying our online conversation comfortably. But just imagine students and family, they cannot afford to have the same level of advanced technology and information and infrastructure in the global south. Many students, they really run short of technology in supporting their learning. So when people may argue the introduction of technology in education, or even over-claiming about AI would certainly replace human being in teaching and learning. And we have to look into the case whether online or technology alone would really satisfy students' educational needs. So I'm very glad that Lingnan University has been part of CGHE in the last 5 years. And in the next 3 years, we are honored again to be part of CGHE. And as a kind of research arm, we focus working in Hong Kong and in China. So for Lingnan University, we have a team of colleagues seriously thinking about higher education policy, development issues, and governance. We certainly believe the world is becoming more complex. We try to understand the diversity of systems, and also try to deconstruct about the notion of globalization. Globalization would not come into the argument about convergent thesis. The more we know about globalization, we have to accept that we are different, but at the same time, in what way we can embrace diversity across different educational systems around the world. And we certainly reflect upon doing higher education research for what, and for whom, and for whose interest. I think doing research is not only for the sake of producing high quality output, and also for the knowledge construction. But more important of all, at Lingnan University, we strongly believe in research, but doing research with carrying out impact with care. we care about society, we care about humanities. So we engage in international, regional research in higher education, trying to work with colleagues from CGHE, working together to understand the world from a more comparative and international perspective. And with that knowledge and also finding, we could advise government, at least we may inform debate in government policy and finding the most appropriate governance model based upon our comparative work. And doing research in higher education is not only about for the sake of research. We are serious about research because we strongly believe in education, because our research finding would inform students' learning. Particularly, I think the platform of CGHE, working with other universities around the world, would create and co-create better learning environment for our students through our partnership. Especially, we are providing more educational experience, research sharing experience for our younger scholars. And I very much hope that in the next few years, we can develop even stronger links for co-promoting, student exchange, especially for PhD students, to enable them to understand research from a comparative perspective. And working with CGHE is a big honor for my team. I think working together, this is a central goal. And in Simon's speech already mentioned, it's about sustainability. I strongly believe we can work together in terms of partnership for promoting and co-promoting sustainable and responsible education. We are really fortunate to get together to engage into serious conversation for doing research, but we are again very mindful that many people in different parts of the world, particularly in the global south, and even within Asia, there's the gap between the rich and the poor is really widening. So in what way we can promote inclusive education and doing research together to find the best way to include more people, they can just like us to enjoy a more sustainable and responsible education. So I would like to call upon collaboration, especially Lingnan is one of the partners of CGHE. I think we certainly hope that next few years, not only about the 10 projects working together as CGHE led by Simon and Claire, but more importantly, would it be appropriate that we engage in more inter-university collaboration for promoting higher education research, not only based upon our partnering institution, but networking institutions elsewhere, as Simon has pointed out. Because it is a global center, I think we must make the global meaningful in reaching out to those countries or area hasn't been, represented fully. So in the next few years, we want to engage in more development policy and governance study, because only through contextual analysis with serious comparative angle, we may find some good practices with contextualization properly for policy learning and promoting policy study across regions and across systems. So Lingnan University is very pleased to be part of the CGHE program. We very much hope that with the partnering of with CGHE, we can promote more East Asia and European dialogue. I think as Simon has mentioned in his talk, and one of the regions in the world has very rapid expansion in higher education is East Asia. So I think some of the universities there have very good research, and in what way we can promote comparative work and also dialogue across region will be interesting. So I want to stop here by thanking CGHE teams and to enable us to work together. So in future, we hope there will be more mobility in terms of student and faculty, and also co-bidding for grants in order to promote international cooperation among us. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Kohar. That's great. So we have some questions. We'd certainly like more questions. Victoria, would you like to ask your question? Victoria Triff. Are you there? No?
Hello.
Oh, hi, Victoria. Good to see you.
This is Victoria Tatrif from the University of Bucharest. First of all, congratulations, Claire, for this special session. Congratulations for all the presenters for today. And especially congratulations for Simon, because his presentation was brilliant. We are crossing challenging times. And my question is related to the perspective of education. What will be the representative in future in order to maximizing educational outcomes?
Who would like to address that? Simon or?
To everybody.
Yeah, happy to come in, but I mean, everyone will have a view about this.
Sure.
Teresa's question, as I understand it, is how do we understand, you know, the success, if you like, or progress, or outcomes in relation to higher education? How do we judge it? And of course, there are many things which we could bring into here, but it seems to me that participation, enrollment in bona fide programs of structured learning is still a centrally important indicator, and it's one that we can use relatively easily because we can gather those data. And a lot of other things which higher education does, I'm thinking on one hand, the complex process of student learning, on the other hand, our indirect impact on, say, through forming citizens or through our contribution to productivity, all those things are much harder to pin down on a large scale or understand their differentiation, their variation, but we can understand participation, and it's still a key indicator for us. But what people learn is really important, because, you know, there's lots of data, say, that my colleague Professor Varghese has done in India, showing that, you know, you can have participation without people learning anything in some circumstances. So participation alone is not enough. Qualitatively, what people learn is really important. How we understand that's a more complex problem, but it seems to me that rather than using metrics or measurements or standardizing learning so that we can compare it over time or between different sites, what we should be doing is using expert scrutiny to look at what people are teaching and learning. That kind of peer evaluation of teaching and learning programs through observation is, although it's more costly, it's much richer in terms of what you can learn about what's going on. But I think also values are important, and we can tell what students think and what their view of the world is. And, you know, we talk a lot about individual outcomes, and we should. Individual outcomes are really important, but what people do socially, how they take their expanded capacity, their capability into the world, that's really important too. And their values and their attitudes. I mean, the sort of values that Kaho talked about, you know, in relation to Lingnan, it's commitments, very simple and very clear. Commitment to a better world in lots of ways. And we should be expecting that from our faculty and from our students, that's the outcome of higher education. And I think we can tell a lot about what graduates think. We can talk to them, we can survey them, we can find out what they're taking from higher education into the world. So I think beyond that, research and science, I think we start to talk about plurality and not just English language knowledge. We start to look for our success in bringing in and connecting to non-English language conversations, forms of knowledge in the post-colonial environment, as well as the old colonial environment, and knowledge outside English. So I think that is something we need to be able to pin down in terms of measurement and start to address effectively.
Thank you. Janja, do you want to add?
No, I will not take time. I fully agree with what Simon said. So I think there's still other questions, and I have nothing to add at the moment.
Kaho?
Well, thank you very much. I think I agree with Simon, but at the same time, I think that's important. Talking about educational outcome, I think the world is now working too hard on talking about the quantifiable measures. But more importantly, we have to look into the student learning from a holistic point of view. and talking about their individual learning experience, and also the construct about the quality assurance mechanism, and whether we have the quantifiable measures or statistics or matrix, would it mean that student learning has been enhanced? So as educator, we have to ask ourselves a very tough question: in what way universities or higher education systems are there for providing and enhancing student learning? If the world is going towards more ranking, and people are very mad about ranking, they may place their resources for doing research leading to publication, but they may at the expense about student learning and also the student learning outcome. I think these are the issues that we can do comparative research as a platform to remind people running university or governments taking care about governance of university should take care about student learning, because after all, in my opinion, the setup of university, one of the very important mission is to enable students to learn better, and we have to make sure the systems are in place to enable students to maximize their learning experience. But now, so much matrix based upon so-called quantifiable objective evaluation that may not be reflecting about how the student feel and also the voice of the student. And we have to pay attention to. Thank you. This is my supplement.
Great, thank you. Johnny, Rich, your question, please.
Thank you very much, Claire, and thank you and congratulations to CG and for all the presentations, which were fascinating. My question was picking up on some of the things that everybody's been talking about in terms of the growth of higher education globally, and whether this is likely to lead to ever bifurcating diversity. Are we going to end up with a wine cellar becoming ever richer with different choices? Or is it more like Coca-Cola, where you're going to get the same thing wherever you go? Or is it going to be more like Coca-Cola, Red Bull, Pepsi, where you've got speciation, you've got a few things where everyone's trying to do the same thing? And I suppose I'm partly driven to think about this by the influence of league tables and whether or not they support diversity or encourage homogeneity.
Right, who would...
I can say something, but it's a great question, of course, and the question of the 1990s and onwards, that once we had communicative globalization and everyone could connect, everything changed. But then we got this remarkable tendency to homogenization through that process, so that while all of the different diverse cultures were in closer contact, the language of that contact was monocultural. And we're now trying to work our way through the contradictions that imposed. I think it's as the prediction on where it's going. Johnny's question is, what's likely to happen? I think that question is open in relation to the extent and type of cultural diversity in the global conversation. That is an open question. We do not know what's going to result here. History would tell us that very strong political economies tend to exert cultural, influence as well. And that's the sort of Martin Jacques argument about China, that China, because it's extraordinary economic and political and social development, will now have a cultural role in the world as well, in terms of values and language and so on. But we also know that culture and language can be very, very resilient. Think of the role of Latin in medieval Europe and how that persisted across cultures for so long. Or you think of the role of standardization of Chinese in Chinese history, how important culture can be and how long-standing and how fixed it can become. So I think whether the world is going to be a continuing monoculture in higher education is an issue to be fought out. And the fact that policymakers and governments seem more keen than ever on the standardized rankings as a way to regulate the sector and establish, their funding programs and their favoured institutions and so on, the stratification they use is a big worry. We do need to pluralise the models, if you like, and we need to do that country by country and piece by piece, and we have not made good progress on that so far.
Kaho, do you want to add?
Okay, well, certainly, I think, Johnny, thank you very much for your question. It's a very important question, not only for higher education researchers, but actually for people, they are keen about the healthy development of higher education. And I agree with you that we are guarded by so many different league tables. And the sort of league table, the quest for so-called world-class university, which really bothers me, because it has come into over-standardization when people talk about international benchmarking. So coming from Asia, to be critical, when people talk about internationalization, we just think about writing and publishing in English, and then we collaborate with the university in the West, and it does mean internationalization. But actually, internationalization is more than that. So to me, I think the world has become so complex, and we have to admit that we don't know about so much differences among us. In what way we can accept we are different, but at the same time appreciate differences and work together to embrace diversity. So the healthy development in future, I would argue, is to respect about differences and also be appreciating about different cultures and history around the world, and make university more vibrant, not only in terms of ranking. And more importantly, I think university leader governments should not just base upon the ranking as the kind of yardstick. But I'm afraid that this is a vicious cycle, because so many individual and family, when they are making their choices of university, they are here to this ranking as a kind of reference point. So we cannot escape from that. But as researchers, in what way we can work together to demonstrate the diversity, this is so important. I think CGHE has set out an extremely important platform for promoting this sort of research across regions to help people to understand we are very much pluralistic rather than only single system. But as an individual, I think we must be aware about we are different, and in what way we can work together for promoting diversity. This is the only way that we can change the environment that we are working on. Thank you.
Great. Okay, I think the next questioner has left.
Claire, sorry, can I just...
Oh, yes, I beg your pardon, Janja.
Yeah, so I just want to add here that it's not only rankings and such metrics and tools that seem to be standardizing the sector, especially now with the increase of the various technology and particular kind of platforms with the global reach and so on. There is also a danger of sort of standardizing the way how we do things and even the content and so on. So I think it will be really important, as mentioned before, that we are really innovative and bold and try to see what is in fact going on, but go deeper and not miss things, so that the governance is actually improved and updated to include these new activities and new actors, which are now far more important than they perhaps were before. I'd also like to say that always we do see counter movements as well in history, and for a particular kind of processes that are happening. So I'm not like Simon and Kaho, I'm not too scared about the dynamism that will happen in future, but we always kind of have to look to the future and study the past. So this is what we can do.
Great. So Diana Laird, you've got a question. Would you like to ask that?
Yes, thank you. Well, terrific presentations, really insightful and inspiring. I thought, well, I have to go back and listen to them all very carefully again, but a couple of points that I think came up more than once. One is that I think we, within universities, have a serious responsibility to improve the inclusivity of higher education. And on the other hand, I think the climate emergency was mentioned at some point. I mean, certainly within the context of research, higher education contributes a lot, but in the context of teaching, we have to reduce the effects of transnational mobility of students, because the aviation industry itself contributes a huge proportion, some 5% the carbon footprint. So all these millions of students having to move about the world to be educated is a serious impact on that. And if we want to reach more local communities overseas, then in both of these cases, if we can switch more to digital education, that's going to make a huge impact on both. And I absolutely understand the point that Simon was making about how the last 6 months has demonstrated to us the extraordinary value and benefit we get from face-to-face interaction between teachers and students, no question. And that has come home to a lot of people. But equally, the fact that there is value and there is benefit in online learning as well has also been discovered by a very large number of people. So I just want to sort of resist the idea that we go back to the way we always were. And what we have to do is to find ways of emulating the way we can operate face-to-face in the new ways in which we're discovering to use online. And I'm sorry, that's not a question, really. It's a statement. Do you agree, I suppose, is my question.
Yeah, no, what do we do, I think is the question, actually.
What do we do? Yeah,
what do we do? I mean, I think the argument for changing our travel practice is overwhelming. I mean, Robin Schultz has got a good paper on this, which shows, you know, what we do to the climate by having as many trips as we do. And it's not just about students, it's about academic practices too. Mm-hmm. I think particularly short flights, you know, the luxury of being able to go to a neighboring or regional country, if you're in Europe or East Asia, Latin America, and, you know, take a flight of an hour and, you know, sure, very convenient, go back the same day, nice for your family, nice for you, but it's not the point. We need to, I think, break the habit of short flights when we can take trains and other forms of transport. That's absolutely clear. I think and I think that the short stay internationalization, which doesn't achieve as much as often people say it does, I have to say, in terms of transformative experience, also needs to be put under the microscope. So the short visits, the short student visits of a few weeks from the US during the summer break into Europe and so on, having a bit of a vacation, learning a bit at the same time, we have to place question marks around that kind of experience. Where I think it's harder is how we handle the long haul travel for the 1 year stay, you know, the 1 year course or something. I think we might be able to make a case which says that we can value that. We can value the travel from India to San Francisco or Shanghai to London for a 1 year stay. What we should place question marks over there, it seems to me, is going back and forth 3 or 4 times during the year, or the additional family visits, or, you know, the sort of level of travel, if you like, becomes an issue there. I think to lose international travel altogether would be regrettable, because there are some forms of mobility which you can't duplicate easily. Now, the point about online, of course, is absolutely right. And you know, because you've been working on this for longer than the rest of us, and we are learning how much we can do in this medium. And what we've got to get out of is this idea that online is a choice vis-a-vis face-to-face as a kind of trade-off or zero sum, you know, antagonism between the two. And I think that has arisen out of the efforts of administrators to consider costs. And they've said, well, online might be cheaper, so we'll do this. I mean, it's not necessarily, of course, always cheaper, but they've said that, and they've seen online versus face-to-face as a kind of economic efficiency question. In fact, what matters is the educational question. And I think where we get to there is we find that they're different modes with different strengths, and they can do different things, and they're both very useful and educationally. And you know, we should be using them both, and we should be using them both in the best possible way. And certainly I agree with the general point that we can use online to expand access, with the caveat that the digital divide's a major issue that we need to address, and that we can also you know, use online to move to a much more responsible travel regime.
Can I just add here? Very much agree with what was said and the importance to think sustainably and about our environment. But not to play a bit of a devil's advocate, but at least to add another perspective, we should look at this issue holistically as well, because of just the huge increase in internet traffic. So think also about the digital infrastructure and all the new servers and the cooling systems, etc. So it's not as simple as to say if we stop traveling, things will get better. And also to think about us as digital subjects. You know, I think it's like ridiculous % of the internet traffic in the US on Netflix streaming. I think it's like 40% of the whole internet. So, you know, just by watching 1 hour of Netflix instead of 2 is already a great contribution to the environment. But now imagine all of the educational and work activities online. Again, not to diminish the role of avoiding less short travel, as Simon said, I very much agree with that, but just we should think about very broadly in all possible ways about solutions we might at the first glance see evaluate as very simple and beneficial. They might not necessarily be such.
Right, thank you. In fact, CG has given us some nice information on the chat about watching online videos that accounts for the world's internet traffic.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thanks, Vasiliki.
Yes, thank you. Okay, we must draw things to an end. We've gone well over the 3 o'clock deadline. My apologies for that, but I didn't want to curtail the discussion. So would either 3 of you want to say anything in conclusion?
Yeah, one very brief thought. Thanks, Claire, for your chairing of today. Great. And your leadership in the centre, and also leadership of Paul Ashman, our other deputy director, you know, also very valuable to us. But let me say thank you to everyone who's participated today. I think that we're really benefiting from the ideas, the viewpoints, the energy that we're getting from these webinars as we form a global and sustain a global community. And, you know, long may it live. Let's continue the discussion and, you know, let's take it all forward.
Well, yes, very much so. And I look forward to contributing to the next 3 years of CG. And I'm sure we'll be able to share our ideas on a continuous basis in this webinar space. The next webinar is on Tuesday. It's going to look at man and woman collaborations in science. So next Tuesday, 2 o'clock, look forward to seeing you. And if not, you know, next week, then if further on in December and then in the new year. So take care, everybody. Thanks to our speakers. Thank you very much indeed. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.